Water changes for planted shrimp tanks. How to mix water for water changes in planted shrimp tanks. Part 1. Caridina. Welcome everyone, it's Ray from RW Aquarium Pages, capturing my journey in planted aquariums, shrimp tanks, and everything in between. One of my key pillars of shrimp keeping in planted tanks is water parameters within range. Shrimp live inside the water and absorb minerals, for example calcium, for their shells and molting. I'll talk about molting issues associated with GH, general hardness, later. I have an excellent video on water parameters in the description below, but in this video, I'll mention how to prepare and mix the water to those parameters. If the parameters are outside the ideal range, the shrimp and plants won't do as well and can possibly and eventually die. If the water is too hard, some plants don't do as well, and algae also grows and spreads better in harder water. First of all, you'll need to know the range of GH, KH, and TDS that you're trying to achieve. I personally use TDS as it's a quick way of checking the hardness of the water. GH and KH are specific measures, whereas TDS is an approximation, and anything in your water can affect the TDS. Let's go with caridina shrimp, which requires a TDS of 130 to 150 parts per million of GH. They only need GH and not KH, so your remineralizer salt must be a GH booster and not a GH and KH booster that's required for neocaridina shrimp. As a result, the TDS will give a GH reading and no KH reading. For example, 130 parts per million TDS divided by 17.9 gives you 7.6 degrees of hardness, which is the ideal range for caridina shrimp. It's always best to start with RODI water in the most ideal scenario, since that's a base of 0, and when you add GH booster, only that is affecting the water. I have an excellent video about using tap water linked below. In the Greater Vancouver area, where I'm currently located, the water is pretty pure. It's about 30 parts per million TDS. If you're in another area which isn't as lucky, you can still buy distilled water at Costco for $3 for 5 gallon, instead of spending a few hundred on an RODI unit. It's best to use RODI water, as it's a base of 0, it's pure without contaminants. Using tap water can have some contaminants that's not ideal to shrimp. You can check with your water analysis report with your city to see if they use chlorine or chloramine, or any other heavy metals that's safe for human but toxic to your shrimp. Alternatively, you can place your tap water in a bucket, test the TDS, and add a few Indian almond leaves and let it sit for a few days, then test the TDS again. It should drop quite a bit depending on what the starting TDS is. That's a trick that I use for my discus water from before. You can also filter the water through peat, and that will drop the pH and the hardness also. This might not take some of the impurities out, as mentioned above. First of all, wash your hands. Shrimp are sensitive to items that our hands have, like hand sanitizer. My friend put his hand with hand sanitizer into his tank, and then he lost all his shrimp. Next, we'll check the TDS of the aquarium. It's at 140 parts per million, so it's slightly higher than the target of 130 parts per million. In a 1 gallon bucket, I use just under 1/8 teaspoon of GH booster, and that will bring the TDS to 100 parts per million. 100 divided by 17.9, which gives a GH of about 5.6 degrees of hardness. Parts per million and degrees of hardness is used interchangeably, But since the TDS meter is so easy to use, parts per million is what I look for when I test the water. I aim for 100 parts per million TDS instead of 130 to 150 parts per million, since the TDS after a while will build up. Either the minerals or toxins or from organic waste in the water. If your tank is at 140 parts per million TDS, changing and replacing it with 100 parts per million TDS new water should bring the TDS value back down and watering down the waste. This is for setting up a new aquarium or for water changes. When you're replacing evaporated water, use pure RODI water, which has a TDS of 0 and a pH around 5 to 7.5. Depending on the CO2 in the air, it's also around neutral and doesn't affect or increase your TDS. You can use any GH booster, salt or liquid. They all work approximately the same. A few common brands are Salty Shrimp and Shrimp Cakes GH Booster. Some have more vitamins than others that's specific for shrimp, but the main ingredient is the same. My chemistry teacher friend also makes his own remineralizer salts and it works perfectly fine. If you do go that route, please use food grade chemicals. Pharmacy grade is not necessary. I'll pour the salt in, and then I'll pour in the water, gushing it, stirring and mixing it. It's best to mix with a power head for 24 hours to fully dissolve the remineralizer salts. But in my case, I'll use my trusty spoon. You can also use warm water to dissolve the remineralizer faster. I do this with my Salty Shrimp Sulawesi Mix 8.5, which is harder to dissolve. In shrimp tanks, I scoop out about 5%, and then I pour back in 5% of freshly mixed water. Since I don't do large water changes and only about 5%, the cooler temperature does a few things. First of all, it's freshly oxygenated water. Secondly, it provides a little shock similar to the rainfall in the wild with fresh water, and it triggers spawning behavior in shrimp and fish. You'll probably see some molts in your shrimp after a water change. The water change amount differs from everyone, and 5% works for me in my tanks, and they're all successful in breeding. Some like to do larger water changes, like 10 to 20%, but the key is to do what works for you, as every aquarium is different and it's dynamic. I'll add a beneficial bacteria product like Stability. It's just to boost the beneficial bacteria colony in the aquarium with the newly freshly changed water. I'm not too sure if this is necessary, but in theory, it sounds good. Voila! And that's completed. For my next video, we'll be mixing remineralizers for neocaridina shrimp, which is GH plus KH, and those water parameters are different. It's very similar, but the calculation is slightly different. Do you use RODI or consider using RODI water? Is the unit a bit too expensive to start off with? Have you used the Indian almond leaf method that's mentioned above? I love sharing my experiences, success and failures with everyone, and capturing my journey in planted shrimp tanks. Stay tuned for more informative videos. Thanks for watching and listening to my rambles. Have an awesome day.
Thanks for watching.